Hello, this is Sonia Costa at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thank you everyone so much for joining today's webinar on opportunities and best practices for meeting housing and homelessness needs during the current coronavirus crisis. We have a great panel of speakers for you today, and we're going to go ahead and get started with a brief welcome from Diane Yantal, who's President and CEO at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Handing it over to you, Diane.
Great, thanks, Sonia, and hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this really important webinar. I know there's tremendous interest and importance in all of us understanding what housing and homelessness funds were included in the CARES Act and how you all can begin to put those dollars to use in your communities to ensure housing stability during and after the COVID-19 crisis. So this webinar today is being hosted by two campaigns that the National Low Income Housing Coalition leads. The Campaign for Housing and Community Development is made up of nearly 80 national housing and community development organizations that work together to achieve the highest possible funding levels for housing and homelessness programs. And the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition is made up of over 850 organizations from around the country, most from communities that have been impacted by recent disasters. And together we work towards an equitable, just, and complete disaster response and recovery. We know that marginalized people, people of color, people with disabilities, people experiencing homelessness, immigrants, LGBTQ people, people re-entering their communities from jails or prisons, these are the people that will be most harmed by disasters, and without dedicated and focused advocacy and action, will be most likely to be left behind in the response and the recovery. So these two campaigns and all of our partners across the country worked together to achieve $12 billion for housing and homelessness in the CARES Act and some very important new eviction and foreclosure moratoriums. So now we want to be sure that we all understand the new policy provisions, the details of them, how and when the money will reach communities. Again, also that you can all begin planning to use those funds to reach the tremendous immediate needs for people who are homeless or who are right on the verge. And as we do this work, it's essential that we center racial equity in the design and the implementation of how these funds are used. We all know that structural racism results in people of color being disproportionately low income and rent burdened. We know that Black and Native people are disproportionately homeless, and Black and Native people are disproportionately dying from COVID-19. And so we have an obligation as we design and implement the solutions to ensure certainly that we don't worsen or reinforce racial inequities, but we have an obligation and an opportunity, right, to correct them by centering racial equity and equity for all marginalized people in the response and the recovery. And of course, we need to continue working together to get Congress to provide more in the next spending package, including a uniform national moratorium on evictions and foreclosures, at least $100 billion for rental assistance and eviction prevention, more funding for ESG, emergency funds for public housing and other housing providers, legal assistance, and more. So we'll discuss all of this and more on today's webinar. We have a really incredible group of speakers today, leaders and partners in the work of ending homelessness and housing poverty. And I want to thank each of you, each of our speakers, for your important work and your leadership. And thanks too for joining today's webinar to share your expertise. So Sonia, I'll turn it back to you now to introduce our first speaker.
Thanks so much, Diane. So before I hand it over, I'm just going to let everybody know kind of the game plan for this next hour. So first, we're going to have Kim Johnson, also from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, give a brief overview of what was in the CARES Act. Then Seamus Roller from the National Housing Law Project is going to talk about the eviction and foreclosure moratorium that was part of that act. Then Steve Berg from the National Alliance to End Homelessness will be talking about the Emergency Solutions Grants that was appropriated in the CARES Act. Then we'll be talking about the Community Development Block Fund Grant, hearing from Marion McFadden and Enterprise Community Partners. Then Mike Wallace will be talking about the Coronavirus Relief Fund. And then we'll be getting into some of those issues of equity that Diane mentioned, and Peggy Bailey from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities will be talking about the impact on marginalized communities, particularly people of color and African Americans. And then we'll be talking about impact on people with disabilities and formerly incarcerated people, hearing from Dara Baldwin at the Center for Disability Rights. And then finally, Sarah Sadian from the National Low Income Housing Coalition will be wrapping us all up to talk about what's in the future and how to engage on future packages. So a full agenda, so let's go ahead, get started. Kim, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Sonia. So hi everyone, thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Kim Johnson and I'm a policy analyst here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and I'm going to provide a quick overview of some of the housing provisions in the CARES Act. So the CARES Act provided $12 billion for HUD programs, including $4 billion for Emergency Solutions Grants, or ESG, $5 billion for Community Development Block Grants, or CDBG, $1 billion for project-based rental assistance, $685 million for public housing, $300 million for tribal nations, $65 million for housing for persons with AIDS, $50 million for Section 202, housing for the elderly, and $15 million for Section 811, housing for persons with disabilities. Next slide, please. The bill also instituted a temporary foreclosure moratorium for all federally backed mortgages, a temporary eviction moratorium for residents of most federally subsidized apartments, and created the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which provides $150 billion in funding for state governments, tribal governments, and local governments with more than 500,000 residents. The flexible funding for ESG, CDBG, and the Coronavirus Relief Fund should be used to address the urgent, immediate needs facing people experiencing homelessness and low-income renters and homeowners, including seniors, people with disabilities, families with children, veterans, survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, formerly incarcerated people, undocumented people, and other individuals disproportionately impacted by this pandemic. As Diane said in her introductory remarks, people of color, and in particular Black and Native people, and members of historically marginalized communities already disproportionately represented among homeless and housing insecure populations due to structural racism and discrimination, have also been the most severely impacted by the coronavirus outbreak. Additionally, data from the CDC show that coronavirus has a disproportionate impact on older adults and people with underlying health conditions. It is absolutely crucial to provide ample funds to ensure that people who are the most affected have both the short and long-term support that they need to remain stably housed during and after this crisis. So with that, I am going to hand it back over to Sonia.
Great, thank you, Kim, for that background about this act and what it provided and why it's important. So we're going to get into more of the details about that funding, and we'll start by first talking about the eviction and foreclosure moratorium. So I'll hand it over to Seamus Roller, who is the Executive Director of the National Housing Law Project. Go ahead, Seamus.
Great, thank you, Sonia. So I'm going to go focus on the eviction moratorium, and I'll give a little bit just at the end about the foreclosure moratorium, though we have a fair amount of information about the foreclosure and the forbearance issues on our website. So I'll start with the first slide, just that it's a 120-day moratorium on filing for eviction for non-payment of rent starting on March 27th. So go to the next slide. The eviction moratorium, it covers it covers a number of different things, but it's not the sort of nationwide comprehensive eviction moratorium that we wanted. So it's got some challenges, and so I'm going to kind of run through those. Some of the details on it, it also requires after the 120 days, it requires that a landlord give a 30-day notice after the end of the moratorium period before the person can be evicted. So in practice, that means at least 150 days, though in most states, you can't give a notice for non-payment of rent until the next day that the rent is due. So in most cases, that's going to be the first of the month that you can give the 30-day notice. So in a lot of states, it'll be a little longer than a 150-day period. The 120 days ends depending upon who you're asking, either July 24th or July 25th as the time period, which means that in practice, this is, we're looking at kind of early September as the time period in which you're going to start to see some evictions roll out for those covered properties. So the kind of fine print on this, tenants are still responsible for paying rent. They just can't be evicted during the moratorium period for non-payment of rent. It only applies to new filings for eviction. So if you were, if the landlord had filed for an eviction before March 27th, that still goes on. The other thing is that there are other kinds of evictions besides non-payment of rent. So for criminal activity, you can still be evicted. In some cases, you may be able to get evicted for a no-cause eviction. Though what we've been really pushing with the attorneys that we work with is that almost all no-cause evictions right now are really for non-payment of rent, and that you should basically argue that any no-cause eviction right now is really an eviction for non-payment of rent and is covered. The other big part of this is that it doesn't apply to every property. So this only applies to essentially all of the federal housing programs. So, HUD, Section 8, project-based Section 8. It applies to the low-income housing tax credit program, all of the housing programs under the Department of Agriculture as well. So all the sort of federal programs that we think about are covered by this. The thing about all of those programs are that they also have some sort of just cause or good cause provisions in there. So those tenants, for the most part, you shouldn't see being evicted for no cause. I think the one issue around this that you will see is that the tax credit program, the regulations are very limited from the IRS. And you will probably see some landlords on tax credit properties who try to evict their tenants for no cause. And there's not always great case law around the country around how to deal with those situations. But any advocates should argue that those tenants can't be evicted, that that's what the federal law is. The other big group is apartments and single family homes with a federally backed mortgage loan. And so that's Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Federal Housing Administration. Figuring out which of those properties have those used to be really difficult. Thankfully, the Low Income Housing Coalition has put out a map and a database of most of the multifamily properties that are covered. The 1 to 4 unit properties, it's still pretty difficult to figure it out, but at least you can figure out most of the multifamily properties nationally that are covered under the eviction moratorium. What you see around the country is some courts are starting to require that any eviction filing include some statement by the landlord that they're not covered by the CARES Act. So we think it's really important that landlords have the onus placed upon them that they have to show that they're not covered. All right, so some of the legal uncertainties around this, the issue that I covered around other evictions that are really motivated by non-payment of rent. The other sort of legal uncertainty is that even if you have a building that's not covered, but that landlord has one tenant that has a housing choice voucher, we believe that the plain language of the statute makes clear that that entire property is covered by the eviction moratorium because they are accepting a voucher under a federal program. HUD has issued some different guidance, but their guidance is basically just junk. It doesn't make any sense, and it's in clear violation of the statute itself. Then there's also some lawyers that are arguing that some of the language around the 30-day rule essentially should cover all evictions. It's some complex from the legal standpoint. I would say that the language seems to imply that, but it runs kind of contrary to the plain overall language of the statute. So you're going to see some cases come up around this over the next couple of months as well. So I think the other thing that I want to flag for everybody is that there are lots of illegal evictions going on around the country, lockouts, other harassment by landlords, violence, unlawful utility disconnections that landlords are doing in an attempt to get people to move out because they can't do it through the eviction process. Make sure that you refer those people to legal aid, and in some cases directly to law enforcement, because these things are, in many cases, criminal actions that landlords are taking to try to evict people from their properties. Lastly, just that there's going to be a big issue, right? That the eviction moratorium was really important, but that we need rental assistance in order to help make landlords whole, and also to make sure that tenants don't get evicted moving forward. And that if the only thing that we have is that landlords can evict people who haven't paid rent, that's just a bad process overall on this. So lastly, just that there is a foreclosure moratorium that lasts for 90 days from beginning of March, and that also that there is forbearance available for 180 days that should be able to last up to a year for those people who have home mortgages as well. And you can access more information on that at our website, nhlp.org, or and some of the other great organizations that are working on this, like National Consumer Law Center. So I have run out of my time. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Seamus. And I see we have a few questions in the chat box already, which is really great. We'll try to get to some of those at the end. If we have enough time, we'll try to answer as many as we can. Okay, so next we'll be talking about the ESG funding. I'm going to hand it over to Steve Berg, who's the Vice President for Programs and Policy at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Steve?
All right, thank you, Sonia. Thank you, everybody, for coming on today. I'm just checking, we're up over 500 participants today, which is a great turnout for this really important topic. I'm going to talk briefly about what's in the bill, specifically about homelessness and the ESG program. You can hit the first slide, please. All right, so the money for specifically for homelessness in the CARES Act is through the ESG program, the Emergency Solutions Grants. Now that's an existing program that's a formula grant to larger cities and counties and to balance of state recipients who cover the rest of the state. In a normal year, ESG is about $280 million. Most of that is subcontracted to nonprofit providers. A lot of it goes for paying homeless shelters or to do rapid rehousing kind of interventions to get people quickly out of homelessness. It can be used for outreach to homeless people, shelters, of course, and rapid rehousing. It can be used both for construction costs and operating costs. Next slide, please. So in the CARES Act, ESG is a little different. The most striking way in which it's different is that it's a lot more money. Remember, I said 280 million is the usual national appropriation for that. This is $4 billion. So it's like 12 or 13 times what the usual ESG program is. And I think that requires people to think very differently about this. And it's not just ESG, but a little more. It's actually a lot more. The law says, the bill that Congress passed says that up to $2 billion will be issued in shortly under the usual ESG formula, and the rest under a new formula that HUD is supposed to develop that'll pay more attention to the specific needs that come about because of the coronavirus. HUD has already announced the first billion and announced how much each grantee, each community will get out of that first $1 billion. They're working really hard to get that money out the door. They're starting to finalize individual communities' performance grant contracts, and the rest will be undertaken shortly. And we expect the whole $4 billion to be out before too long. Next slide. So besides being a lot more money, the CARES Act also provides ESG in a way that that provides a little more flexibility. And I mean, in general, it's a very flexible funding source, but this flexes it up even more. There's no matching requirement on this ESG. So usually there is a matching requirement, no matching requirement on the CARES Act ESG. There's no shelter cap. Remember I said usually you can use ESG for shelter, or you can use it for other things like outreach and rapid rehousing. Usually there's a cap on what percentage you can use for shelter, and you can't go above that. There's no shelter cap on this. If the community wants to spend the whole thing on emergency shelter, they can do that. If they want to spend they want to spend nothing on emergency shelter, they can do that. In terms of the people that are eligible for services, usually ESG pays for services for people who are homeless and for people who are at risk of homelessness. And then there's a long rule about what counts as at risk of homelessness. In this bill, they really simplified the whole at risk of homelessness thing, and they just said anybody whose income is under 50% of area median is considered at risk of homelessness, and they're eligible for help from ESG. So that means a lot of low-income people who are not homeless yet but are struggling to hold on will be eligible for this help. And then finally, there's no treatment or performance requirements allowed to be imposed by programs that are funded by this money. So for example, you can't tell somebody, you can't fund a shelter with this program that's going to tell people, well, you can't come into this shelter unless you take psychiatric meds or unless you agree to participate in a work program or something like that. They just felt those kinds of things are inappropriate for this purpose. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and just as we look at ESG, some of the uses that this will be good for and that communities are really looking for funding to use, certainly shelter expansion, more shelters so that people who are living outside can get back into shelter. Shelter deconcentration, the CDC has put out guidelines about homeless shelters, which among other things says that only a certain number of people should be put in a certain space for sheltering. Many homeless shelters often try to pack as many people as they can into whatever space they have so that nobody has to sleep outside. But the CDC guidance says you've got to have a certain amount of space. And so ESG is a good source for paying for more space to add additional shelter. It's a good source for non-congregate shelter. People have seen in the news a lot about how homeless people are being put in hotel rooms if they're particularly at risk. One thing is that recent guidance from FEMA has sort of indicated that for people doing the hotel room thing, FEMA is probably the best first choice to pay for the hotel rooms, but ESG is available to back up to pay the part that FEMA will pay and to pay for other kinds of services in non-congregate shelter. It's good for connection with permanent housing, to pay for people to do landlord outreach, to pay staff to outreach to landlords to try to get people quickly into regular housing. And then of course, ESG can pay for rent assistance in housing for up to 2 years. It won't pay for a permanent rent subsidy, but it pays for temporary rent subsidies up to 2 years. Next slide. And this is me. Any other questions you have, please feel free to be in touch, and I'll turn it back to Sonia.
Thank you, Steve. And thanks everyone for typing in your questions throughout. We're trying to answer them as well. And any that we don't get to, we will be able to follow up with you. Okay, moving on from ESG, we're going to be talking about the funding for community development block grants. And I'm going to hand it over to Marion McFadden, who's the Senior Vice President of Public Policy and Senior Advisor for Resilience at Enterprise Community Partners. Marion.
Thanks, and thank you for the invitation to join today. I'm going to talk a little bit about unemployment insurance before I dive into CDBG. just so we can make the connection about how much money people have right now and what they can expect. The CARES Act provided $250 billion to expand unemployment benefits. So the first thing it did was allow self-employed and independent contractors to get unemployment insurance, as well as people who were just had their hours reduced rather than were completely terminated. It's also making more money available, so furloughed workers can get an additional $600 per week as an across-the-board payment through the end of July. And also it extends the period of availability of benefits by 13 weeks beyond what states currently allow. Next slide. More than 26 million people have filed for unemployment benefits in the past 5 weeks. This is a historic high, to say the least. More than 40 states are now paying out that additional $600 a week. And the rest of the states are working to catch up state unemployment insurance benefits very greatly. So the average person receives $378 a week in unemployment benefits, but state to state, you really do see a huge variation, and that's why Congress decided to put in the additional $600 payment. States have already accessed about 600 million of the 1 billion that the CARES Act gave them to hire additional staff, and they've been redeploying state workers from other divisions to process claims. Despite all of that effort and the additional funding, we are hearing grave concerns all over the country about how quickly benefits are going to be paid, given that people have urgent and immediate needs to meet their expenses. And also there's a huge concern over the large number of households who are out of work but are not going to be able to access unemployment insurance because they won't qualify. Next slide. We are hearing concerns about increased costs and then also delays in the affordable housing pipeline. So at the individual level, incomes have gone down dramatically. People find themselves paying more for healthcare, for food, for cleaning supplies, for utilities and transportation. And given the high morbidity rate, families are also taking on the costs of end of life and burial expenses. At the building owner level, there you see owners of affordable housing paying more to sanitize their common areas and apartments. They're keeping staff working overtime and in some cases for the first time, providing medical support, social services, food, and transportation to the residents, all while navigating the increased cost of utilities, which are up because so many people are staying at home 24/7. And then also I mentioned the affordable housing production pipeline. Social distancing recommendations have resulted in shortages in construction materials, delays in permitting and local approvals, and severe interruption of property managers' ability to interact with residents and key partners to continue their regular property operations. And then in some jurisdictions, we've seen complete moratoriums on construction. So this is a concern as we think ahead to affordable housing units that we're going to need coming out of this crisis. And I would also mention that most of the affordable housing in this country is built or preserved through the low-income housing tax credits, which are administered by state housing credit agencies. And now they have limited or even no ability to complete their development approvals and go through their normal processes to get affordable housing moving. Next slide. So much as you heard about the Emergency Solutions Grant that Steve described, Congress provided funding through the CDBG program with additional flexibility for HUD to tailor the program to this need. This is something that HUD does, that Congress does after natural disasters through the CDBG Disaster Recovery Program. HUD is calling this the CDBG CV program. There's a total of $5 billion. HUD has already allocated the first $2 billion and provided that money to all 50 states plus an additional 1,200 jurisdictions using the fiscal year 2020 formula for CDBG. So in addition to their 2020 CDBG grants, they got a plus up of $2 billion across the nation. There's an additional $1 billion from the CARES Act for states and insular areas to address their coronavirus related needs. And those have to go out of HUD by May 11th. Something that I would call out for those of you who live in cities that receive your own CDBG allocations. though that $1 billion can be used in your jurisdictions as well as in the places that the state CDBG program normally serves. So that means you'll want to be in touch with your states about the housing needs that you're facing. Also, there's a remaining $2 billion that must be allocated by the HUD Secretary on a rolling basis through a formula that the Secretary makes up that's based on coronavirus-related factors that include housing impact. So again, here it's important to stay in touch with HUD as well as with your congressional delegation to ensure that your housing impacts are known by your elected officials. And then also, according to the law, there is no cap on the amount of funding that can be subgranted by these states and localities to nonprofits. Ordinarily, that's capped under the law. Most communities, it's at 15%, but now there is tremendous flexibility in providing those funds, including to housing organizations. Next slide. Also, HUD has flexibility for the existing CDBG dollars that have already been provided to communities. HUD published some waivers, they call them suspensions. Those are available on the HUD website, but one of the things I would call out is that HUD gave flexibility to communities to move their money into new activities. But here, instead of doing a normal 30-day comment period, it's waived down to 5 days. So we'll all want to be paying attention to what our communities are doing with the CDBG funds that they have on hand. HUD has provided guidance on how funds can be used to address coronavirus, but has not specifically called out housing in those uses. We have heard from a lot of large cities that they're considering using the CDBG money that they have on hand to do temporary rental assistance programs. That's currently allowable without a waiver, as long as it's paid up to 3 months, and the funds for rent or utilities have to go directly to the landlord or to the utilities. They can't be paid as cash to the renter, to the tenant. Open question. Is HUD going to grant a suspension or waiver to allow CDBG recipients to use their money for rental assistance beyond 3 months? HUD has set up an email box, CPD questions answered at hud.gov, and they post answers to the questions on the HUD Exchange. Also, I'd like to invite you all next week on Wednesday the 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern. Enterprise is going to host a CDBG CV webinar. Acting Assistant Secretary for Community Planning and Development at HUD, John Gibbs, will be there, and you can ask him your questions live as well. Next slide. I underscore Diane's remarks at the beginning that we need additional advocacy for resources because what's been provided is nowhere near the scope and scale of what communities need to address the financial impacts on the economy of the coronavirus. And I look forward to hearing Sarah's remarks toward the end of the hour. A couple of things that I would call out as needed for advocacy because they weren't included in the CARES Act. Funding for the home program. The home program provides flexible grants to communities that can be used for people at 60% of area median income and below for housing through a variety of forms. Also funding for the Section 4 capacity building program, which provides grants and technical assistance to CDCs nationwide. This is an important time for them to be able to retool their programming and make sure that they're accessing direct funds and support to make the best decisions locally about the resources they have on hand and access additional federal resources. Inexplicably, USDA's rural development housing programs were left out of the CARES Act. So we would like to ensure that those funds, like those programs, like HUD programs, receive additional funds. We'd like to see funding for the CDFI fund at Treasury. And if you take a look at the Action Campaign website at rentalhousingaction.org, you can see the requests that we have about establishing minimum 4% credit and others, actions that can be taken regulatorily and statutorily to support the low-income housing tax credit. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marion. Really appreciate that overview, both of UI and CDBG. So now we're going to be talking about the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which was for states and localities and tribal governments and territorial governments. So I'm going to hand it over to Mike Wallace, who's the Legislative Director for Community and Economic Development at National League of Cities, to tell us a little more about that.
Great, thank you all. I don't have any slides for you today because it was just late last night. The Treasury Department actually issued the formal guidance we've been waiting for on these funds. So excited to share what we know about those today and how they can be useful to state and local governments to preserve housing stability and address homelessness as a result of the COVID-19 virus. So we at NLC work directly with local elected officials and cities and towns of all sizes, every population level, large and small. The CARES Act that authorized the Coronavirus Relief Fund only allocated funding directly under this fund to the states and to cities with a population higher than 500,000 residents. However, we worked very hard to get them to explicitly make it possible for states to share their allocation with cities and towns of all sizes. So as we speak, I know that local elected officials in states across the country are engaging with their state leaders to try to convince them to adopt a fair plan for sharing this funding in order to help local governments everywhere meet their needs. We have been telling at NLC, we've been telling local elected officials for a long time now that housing stability is really a prerequisite to helping residents with economic mobility, with job security, with health and well-being. Because of the shutdown, we know that efforts to help residents are going to be set back, but we know from the previous recession caused by the subprime mortgage crisis that without housing stability, pretty much any effort you expend for economic recovery is going to be stunted. And we have many cities who still never have fully recovered from the last recession. And a large part of that is because they were not able to provide stable housing over the long term and continue to struggle with those problems. So we're asking local officials and telling local governments they really need to prioritize housing stability through this crisis in order to emerge in a way that can really facilitate recovery whenever we overcome the pandemic and are ready to end the economic pause that we're in now. Housing instability and homelessness really need to be top level priorities. And so it's good to hear that many jurisdictions are thinking about CDBG in that way. So for the Coronavirus Relief Fund, as I said, states can transfer payments to local governments for qualified expenditures. So while there is more than enough need to meet, there's still a rule that says if you don't spend these funds by the end of the year, by December 30th, 2020, they're going to get returned to the Treasury. So you as advocates and practitioners, our members, we need to work very hard to make sure none of this funding is returned, that this funding really ought to be used to stabilize households and residents on the economic margins through the duration of this crisis. So funding, according to Treasury, funding can be used to respond directly to the emergency that we're in. It can also be used to respond to the second order effects of the emergency, such as by providing economic support to those suffering from unemployment or business interruptions due to the closure. So certainly we think that housing instability is one of those second order effects that we're talking about here. What the funds cannot be used to do is fill shortfalls in government revenue to cover expenditures that would otherwise qualify under the statute. So generally what this means is funding under this fund can be used for activities that weren't already budgeted, like in state and local budgets. So to the extent there was already funding budgeted for housing assistance, this funding can't replace that if the government stops doing that as a result of lost revenue. So generally this is for unbudgeted emergency spending. So there is a long list at the Treasury website of non-exclusive eligible expenditures. That means they've listed out what they say are eligible, but that doesn't mean other forms of spending aren't also eligible. So economic support for those suffering from interruption of their employment due to the crisis. We're telling Treasury that cities would benefit from knowing more there, but our read is that there's no reason that these funds could not be used to support rent, mortgage, utility, food, childcare needs, any number of economic supports necessary that residents cannot meet as a result of a decrease in their wages or not receiving an income because of COVID-19. our read is that all those things should be eligible uses. Also in the guidance, expenses for care for homeless populations provided to mitigate COVID-19 effects and enable compliance with public health precautions are eligible. Related expenses to maintain state prisons and county jails, including sanitation and improvements of social distancing to enable compliance with COVID-19 public health precautions is eligible. And so is payroll expenses for public safety, public health, healthcare, human services, and similar employees whose services are substantially dedicated to responding and mitigating the effects of the public health emergency. So we read that to mean including payroll expenses for public employees working on emergency housing measures to keep people stably housed and to address homelessness throughout the crisis. There is also a list of ineligible expenditures that cannot be used to be reimbursed for this funding. One thing it says is that you cannot use an expenditure that's already being reimbursed by some other federal program. So if you're a household that's already receiving federal housing assistance through some other federal program, a HUD program or otherwise, a USDA program, generally you would not want to use the CRF funds in conjunction with those. This is going to be useful for households that are not receiving another form of assistance already. And certainly we know that the number of eligible households actually receiving rental subsidies right now is dismally low, so there is plenty of need out there. Again, I just want to emphasize that we are focused on the housing uses for Coronavirus Relief Fund, for CDBG, etc. Housing is only one of several possible uses. And so I encourage you as advocates, as we are at NLC, I encourage you as advocates to be vocal to your local elected officials and let them know that Coronavirus Relief Funds monies, that CDBG monies, that all of these ought to be focused on providing for housing stability, and that there are lots of resources at the League of Cities and all the other organizations you've heard from today to talk about. One of those resources we helped to put together alongside the National Alliance and Homelessness, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, is a guidance for local elected officials to use CARES funding for housing stability and homelessness. And there's 8 steps there. Among them are appoint housing stability leads, appoint housing leads across jurisdictions, because ESG and CDBG do not go to every single city and town, but they should be beneficial to everyone in the region. As we heard earlier, enact uniform eviction moratoriums within jurisdictions so that local officials have the power in most states to, in a uniform way, bring all residences, including for residents of long-term residents of motels and hotels, to bring them into an eviction moratorium in the short term. We have real life city examples of lots of cities of all different sizes doing these things. We expect to put more examples up as cities acquire coronavirus relief funds to do these sorts of activities. Right now, if you want more information on the coronavirus relief fund, I would direct you to Treasury where those documents are, but we will certainly at NLC be building out additional guidances in the coming days.
Thanks so much, Mike. Really appreciate all that information. And I know that Kim just shared a few links to some of the guidance that Mike just referenced. Now we are going to move on to talk about some issues of equity. And I'm going to turn it over to Peggy Bailey, who's the Vice President for Housing Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Peggy?
Hello, and hello, everybody. I wish that I could go through a list like everyone else on the call and say these are the provisions that particularly will help us achieve a more equitable society. But alas, I cannot. And I think the last 45 minutes show you why. With every program, there are exceptions and eligibility requirements and gaps or cliffs that are created. And we know that that's where inequities happen. So for us on this call, I think the focus where I'm going to focus on is the implementation. So all of you who are at the state and local level who are looking at how to use these dollars to achieve more equitable outcomes for people, and to challenge us all on what we should be pushing for in the next package. I think the first place to start is to remember that the way that we've organized this call isn't the model for how to do equity, right? That thinking about more equitable solutions for people has to be integrated and centered in everything that we do in order to make sure that we're doing what we can to close these gaps. And people have to be at the center of what we're working on. Thinking about who is it that we're trying to help and how do we make sure that we're getting help to them in as easy a way and a non-judgmental and a non-paternalistic way as possible. If all of the same people we know get left out, are overrepresented in those that are left behind, then we know that we aren't pushing for equitable strategies or policies. And I want to use the next slide to show, my only slide, to show what I mean by this. You'll see that this is a slide that we have on our website that tracks Black unemployment and white unemployment. For those of you who have been following the federal conversation, you'll know that a lot of it is centered around work and how do we help workers, which is code for how do we help those who deserve our help. Well, you can see by this slide that that frame is inherently inequitable. Even in the best of times for Black people, we don't reach the unemployment. We barely touch the worst of times for white people. And if we looked at other races, this slide would be very similar. And so that means that our normal solutions of thinking all tides raise all, a rising tide raises all boats is flawed. You know, what Diane mentioned at the beginning of the call is right. It's up to all of us to push solutions of equity because our leaders aren't. And we have to be able to bring the evidence to the table and be honest about what we're asking for, who is going to be left out, and keep seeking to close those gaps. Tools like what the Urban Institute and what the National Low Income Housing Coalition have put together around how to target help to neighborhoods is an example of this. Thinking about not just closing the gaps, as I've talked about, but how can we actually increase resources and target resources to those who we know are falling through the gaps or are historically discriminated against. It is, and we have to remember that it isn't the fact, just because we work on housing doesn't mean that we're striving for equitable solutions. If we're not, you can tell, if that were the case, we would be a lot better off and people would be a lot better off, and it's not. So we are not automatically centering equity simply by the fact that many of the people that we serve are those that are in marginalized populations. You know, I think Dr. Ibram Kendi spoke at our annual conference in December. And ever since then, I've really thought about the frame of the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And given that it's a bestseller, I'm assuming a lot of you have all read this book too. And I think it's important not just to read it and not just to celebrate Dr. Kendi and his work, but to really ask ourselves every day, did I live up to the vision that he's putting in front of us on how to be an anti-racist? And what am I going to do tomorrow to do better? I hope that we all start to do this and start to ask, and not only just ask it to ourselves in the mirror, but ask it out loud and make sure that people of color are in the room when we ask it out loud, so that we're really, so that we're not just talking a good game and using the right words when it comes to equity for not just people of color, but also other marginalized populations, but that we're actually living it out, even in times when we're sometimes told that the ways that we want to achieve it, like housing for all, are not politically viable. So that's where I will leave it and pass it back.
Thank you so much, Peggy. Really, really appreciate that. going to just keep things moving as quickly as possible. I'm going to hand it over to Dara Baldwin, who's the Director of National Policy at the Center for Disability Rights, to continue this conversation.
Thank you. Peace and blessings. And I want to thank you and caveat off of what Peggy Bailey was discussing. So I'm going to talk about the disability community, disabled folks, as well as formerly incarcerated, and exactly what was said. For disabled folks and formerly incarcerated, there were gaps and there were disenfranchisement and multi-marginalization for that community way before COVID. And as you see in the package deal, $15 million was given towards Section 811, and that's for a country of over 50 million people with disabilities. So we hope to see that money go out into the community and to keep disabled folks in their homes. For those of you who work on emergency management, you know that during these times, this is when the most disenfranchised are even more disenfranchised, and disabled folks are scared about being kicked out of their homes for those who are already living independently. And we're seeing that even though the rental protections are being put up, we are seeing people who have been receiving eviction notices, and this is incorrect and right against their civil and human rights, because this is a time that landlords feel that they can get those people out. We also see that people who unfortunately will not have their housing assistance at the time, the services they need to stay in their home. Peggy said it, it's not just housing. We see transit systems getting rid of their paratransit, so they can't get to their medical doctors. There's still acute care that needs to go on, not just COVID care. We have people who need to see doctors and physicians and nurses at all times in their lives, and so we see that happening. And we know that the National Low Income House Coalition has been a great partner with us in this work, and we appreciate that. I must say I'm a proud board member of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, so we want to keep moving those things forward. We do have several resources for disabled folks to reach out to. They can reach out to their P&A, their Protection and Advocacy Program. Go to National Disability Rights Network's website to find that in your state. There's one in every state, every territory, and one specifically for the Indigenous Native American community. That is where civil rights lawyers will be to assist disabled folks who are having any kind of problems with their housing right now or any other civil rights issue. And then you also have the Centers for Independent Living, CILS, which is who I work with, and there's supposed to be one in every state. There's more than one, right? Texas has 45. And you can go to the National Council on Independent Living's website and click on there to find your local CIL to help out any disabled folks. We also have an emergency fund that's going out, and I will put that number in the chat to help out people with disabilities who need any kind of help around housing, mental health services, or things like that. And then formerly incarcerated community, there has been a push to get people out of the jails, prisons, juvenile systems, as well as detention centers, because public health officials and epidemiologists have said the disease will grow in there and they will die at higher rates. And so we are working tirelessly with people on the ground who are trying to provide housing for formerly incarcerated. And we all know that reentry services are things that are not funded at the same levels as all of these other programs were, as Peggy said. They are also barriers put up so that they can't receive those things. And we want people to know that Medicaid programs in the CARES Act, that was put in there. They should receive those programs. They should receive some type of housing vouchers. They are entitled to those things. So I put my contact information in the chat box. Please reach out to me if you need any information around that. We want to make sure we uplift all disadvantaged, disenfranchised, and multi-marginalized communities. And since Peggy discussed a book, I'll discuss a book that has come out by a Black disabled author that I think people should read as well, which is around racism. And she has a whole chapter on housing. It's called Hood Feminism, and it's by Mickey Kendall. And I'll put that in the chat room as well. I want to thank everybody on this call for your tireless efforts. Please be careful out there and stay safe.
Thank you so much. And we definitely encourage folks to be thinking about, with this funding, with other funding resources, filling those gaps and figuring out who is and who is not accessing the resources that are so needed in this time and always. Okay, we're going to wrap up now with Sarah Sadian, the Vice President of Policy at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, to talk about engagement for future packages. Sarah? Great, thank you so much. Many of you may have heard that Congress is currently moving a bill through Congress. It was approved by the Senate on Tuesday, and there is a vote scheduled to start at 1:30, so it's in the House, so it's in process right now. It's about a $500 billion package, mostly in small business loans, and it is expected to pass sometime today, and it will head to the president's desk for his signature. The bill includes, I mentioned before, about $360 billion in different types of small business loans. Those are resources that might be helpful for affordable housing providers. But beyond those resources, it did not include any funds to address the very urgent housing and homelessness needs in our communities. It also didn't include funding for state and local governments or funding for food assistance. And so on the whole, we're very disappointed that this bill is moving forward without those provisions that are so important. I will say that even before the ink is dry on this bill, House and Senate leaders are already turning their attention to a future coronavirus response package. They're debating right now what the scope of that bill will be and even whether one is needed. We're seeing from Senate Republicans that they are really slamming the brakes on a large spending bill in the coming weeks. They're citing concerns about deficit spending and pushing back on whether or not these funds are needed at all. Democratic leaders in the House and Senate, meanwhile, are putting together their list of priorities of what is going to be at the top of their agenda. So for advocates, the next 2 weeks are going to be incredibly important to lift up and raise the housing and homelessness issues that we're seeing in our communities and the needs that you have. So please continue to reach out to your senators and representatives and urge them to address these needs in the next bill. I will say that members of the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding are pushing for a really broad range of housing and homelessness resources to address the urgent needs of people in our communities, including, as I mentioned, people experiencing homelessness, low-income renters and homeowners, seniors, people with disabilities, families with children, survivors of domestic violence, formerly incarcerated people, and other individuals. I won't go through the entire list of resources that folks are pushing for, but I just will call out a couple of them. One, we know that the most urgent needs are facing people experiencing homelessness, and we and others are pushing for at least another $11.5 billion in resources to help keep people experiencing homelessness safe and healthy during this pandemic. And there's also a really important emerging proposal from Senate and House Democrats for $100 billion in emergency rental assistance, which we think is really important to keep people in their homes during the crisis. NLIHC has done some research and has found that at least $100 billion is needed to make sure that the lowest income people are able to remain stably housed. And we're hoping to see that in the next package, although it's going to take all of our hard work pushing for those resources. As we look to the next spending package, though, it's important for you to focus on who we think our most top targets are. I think it's pretty clear that when it comes to housing resources, we need to do as much work as possible to not just have this on the list of priorities for Democrats, but making sure that it's higher up on the list, on their list of priorities, so that when they're negotiating with Republicans, we're able to get the resources that we need. If you live in Speaker Pelosi's district or in New York, where Senate Minority Leader Schumer is located, you have a very hard task ahead of you. It's incredibly important for you to be reaching out to them and weighing in with them. I'll also say, though, that as you reach out to your members of Congress, if it's not those leaders, you'll want to ask them to weigh in with leadership about the needs for housing and homelessness. So rather than signing on to any particular bills, we're asking all members of Congress to weigh in with their leadership offices. Beyond those two, we're also very focused on key Republicans who will be in the negotiating room. That includes the Banking Committee Chairman, Mike Crapo, the Transportation HUD Appropriations Chairwoman, Susan Collins from Maine, and Mitch McConnell. Again, if you live in those states, you have a really important job ahead of you to make sure that they understand just how critical these resources are. Our targets also include Republicans who have played a role on housing and have demonstrated an interest in housing. So that's Senator Young from Indiana, Portman from Ohio, Romney from Utah, as well as House Democrats and others who are either in leadership positions or are very close to Nancy Pelosi, and we think could play a major role in influencing her. So Jeffries, Lowy, Diaz-Balart, and Clark. Finally, if you have Republicans on the Senate Banking Committee, and you can follow that link to see if there are any that are from your state, they have a really important role to play here too, because that committee will be have to give their approval for anything that's really in the bill. So we need to make sure that all House and Senate, Republican and Democrat, are all on board with these housing and homelessness resources to the greatest extent possible. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Sonia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you so much to all of our speakers. It's a pretty crazy time, and so I really appreciate you all coming on to share your expertise with everyone and for helping answer everyone's great questions that they submitted in the chat box and in the Q&A. We don't have time. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We said an hour, and so we're not going to get into any questions and answers, but I hope that everyone was able to get their questions answered, and we will be sharing this recording, and it will have everyone's contact information. So if you have follow-up questions, please reach out. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today, and be well.